and welcome to another History Revision podcast. This time it is on the situation in Russia in 1914 before World War One broke out. Russia in 1914 was in a state of flux. It was evolving into a modern European-style state with a civil society. Yes, it had three particularly Russian problems. The Tsar wants to play a world role in the Balkans. Russian society is deeply divided due to the slow emergence of the middle class, and the Tsar's view of his own dynasty and his own role. Economic development. In 1908 to 1913, industrial growth had gone up by the rate of 8.5% a year. Entrepreneurs prospered as more workers from the countryside came into the towns. There was more investment from overseas, and it even increased Russian investment, especially from the state, to re-equip and modernise the army and the military further after the loss in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. It was now the fourth biggest heavy industry of coal, iron and steel, as well as gold, second in oil, the fifth largest industrial power overall after Britain, America, Germany and France. Germany was eager to declare war in 1914 before Russia got bigger than Germany industrially. So how strong was the economy? Between 1908 and 1914, state revenue went from 2 billion rubles to 4 billion rubles. Factories went up from 22,600 to 24,900. Industrial output went up by 60%. Absolute progress was impressive, taking into account the problems of the population growth. The idea of gigantism, the building of huge factories, helped mass production and saved money on economy of scale. However, in 1913, the Russian industry only contributed 20% of its national income and employed only 5% of its labour force. Population went up from 93 million to 121 million between 1897 and 1913, with massive growth in the two main cities, St. Petersburg at that point, and Moscow. This hampered growth. Russia was still growing comparatively slowly in terms of national income compared to Britain and Italy, for example, and others as well, and was way behind still in foreign trade. So £190 million in 1913 compared to 1 billion, over £1 billion for Great Britain. But then Great Britain weren't suffering a population explosion. Gigantism created a large class-conscious workforce that became politicised very easily. The social costs. The improvement in health services were provided by the Zemstva, and the state health insurance was introduced in 1912. In 1907 to 1912, spending on education rose from 1.8% of the budget to 4.2%. Between 1905 and 1914, there was 77% growth in the number of pupils and 85% in growth in the number of schools. Between 1900 and 1914, literacy rate rose from 30% to 40%. However, they did not gain a great deal from industrial expansion, the workers. There's no legal protection from their employers, for example. Wages rose only from 245 rubles to 264 rubles per month, but inflation rose by 40% in the very same period. Some workers were better off than others, though. Despite improvement in education, levels of education were still low, and self-improvement was still difficult. Four-fifths of the peasantry, four-fifths of the country, was still peasantry, and so there can't have been any great industrial expansion. Plus, 40% literacy means 60% were illiterate. The revival of the workers' movement in 1912 shows a frustration, and the massacre of 500 striking miners in the Lena Goldfields massacre in 1912, the Bolsheviks were involved in spreading that strike, remember, which was in Siberia, led to sympathetic protests and strikes over the next 2 years. 3 million in that period were involved in strikes. The condition of Russia then overall in 1914. On the positive side, it had an elected parliament, and along with Zemstva, this provided a forum for debate about policies and legislation involving people in the lawmaking. Autocracy had been weakened, and there seems to be a move towards constitutional monarchy. The condition of the peasantry had improved due to Stolypin. Cancellation of redemption payments in 1907 and the increase in grain prices after 1900 helped. In the first 2 years of Stolypin's agrarian reforms, 15% of peasantry took up new opportunities to leave the Mir or to consolidate their land into a bigger block. By 1914, 25% of over 100 million plus peasants had left the Mir, and that's a lot of people, and 10% of them had consolidated their holdings into one bigger chunk of land. Kulaks had established themselves as an efficient and independent agricultural producing class, and they supported industrial growth. The economy was much sounder, less reliant on foreign investment and more self-financing. However, another French loan had made Russia financially stable after 1909, plus gold reserves were rising. Industrial development had been impressive in light and in heavy industries and was now able to compete with the West. There was some increase in educational improvements and condition in workers in their lives and conditions improved slightly. There's an expansion in the number of professionally qualified people, suggesting that had been modernisation. In many ways, Russia looked as though it was on an upward curve, which could have continued if it hadn't been for World War I. The future looked promising for the Tsar and the governing classes. The liberal classes had become more conservative since 1905, not wanting to mix with the revolutionaries again. The undermining of the Dumas and police repression, as well as internal squabbles between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, for example, had weakened the radicals. Attention now could be turned to the Balkans. However, on the negative side, the Duma that had been established had no real power. The great illusion of our century, it was, according to Visser. The position of the Dumas is undermined by the fundamental laws and by Stolypin, when he changed the franchise, for example. In the Duma and Zemstva, it's the voice of the liberal well-to-do that dominated decision-making. And Stolypin's reforms in agriculture were helping some, but hurting others, and applications to consolidate land or leave the Mir were declining after the initial rush, and only the more prosperous peasants were really benefiting, for example in the Black Earth regions. The full impact of Stolypin's agrarian reforms would have only become clear a generation later, even according to Stolypin himself. Industrial expansion made for desperate living conditions, 60% illiteracy, basic education for many, not enough teachers or doctors for all areas, a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And Russia was ruled by a Tsar who failed to appreciate the social and political consequences of economic modernisation. He was too much a part of the past to be an effective ruler at this point in time. Autocracy was oppressive, reactionary and inefficient, persecuting minorities and propped up by a superstitious church with incompetent leaders, as in the army. And it remained hostile to reform. It was unwilling to support the reforms of its two greatest ministers, Witte and Stolypin, who were actually trying to preserve autocracy, and it threw away its greatest chance to save itself. Nicholas became more detached as strike troubles grew, allowing Rasputin to gain influence at court, and his corrupt behaviour and influence over appointments in church and army caused resentment within the very people the Tsar needed to prop up the monarchy. The politicians inside and outside of court, priests and civil services, were the ones that he required the support of for autocracy, and those are the ones that got racked off by Rasputin. Politically, there was still tension. None of the issues which caused 1905 had been truly resolved, and many assassinations were still happening. For example, Stolypin, between 1905 and 1909. There were 2,828 terrorist assassinations in that period, even though the Okhrana and the gendarmerie foiled lots. The strong anti-Tsarist feeling in the Duma and Zemstva and restlessness amongst peasants and industrial workers showed that Russia was on a knife edge in 1914, and the waves of strikes after the Lena Goldfields massacre. By 1914 there were more workers out on strike than in 1905. Many of these strikes were organised and encouraged by the Bolsheviks, who dominated the trade unions. Pravda was at that point selling 40,000 copies a day. Overall, Russia had recovered well from the events in 1905, and the prospects of stability were good until World War I intervened. However, there was still a lot of things that could go wrong with Russia, and as we know,